So good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about FEMA's mission and to share our organization's movement to build community resilience and reduce disaster suffering. Mitigation, building codes, understanding risk and insurance are at the core of individual and community resilience. They impact more than just the bottom line. They also alleviate human suffering that we see time and time again once the storm has cleared. To successfully build community resilience, we must move towards a framework where pre-disaster mitigation and disaster recovery are locally executed, state-managed, and federally assisted. I've seen firsthand the value of community-led mitigation and recovery in my hometown of Beatrice, Nebraska. In 1973, Beatrice experienced its biggest flood event on record, with a Big Blue River cresting at nearly 20 feet above its flood stage. The river has flooded many times since, 1993, 2012, 2015, and most recently this past April, where flooding wreaked havoc across a good portion of Nebraska. At some point, you have to start doing something to reduce the impact of repetitive flooding. For Beatrice, that was after the 1973 flood, when the town began to purchase flood-prone properties. Serving as mayor 2 decades later, I increased investments in the buyout program. We relocated public infrastructure and converted land into parks, open spaces, and recreational areas. The benefit of our floodplain management mitigation strategy became evident when the Big Blue overflowed after the '93 Midwest floods and each subsequent event. Nebraska Emergency Management reported that the April floods caused $439 million in damage to public infrastructure and $85 million damage to homes and businesses. This is a real disaster for Nebraska. But because of investments in mitigation, in Beatrice, there was no physical structure damage. It's a long way from leading mitigation efforts for a small town in Nebraska to leading FEMA's efforts to build resilience across the nation. However, my focus for both has been the same. Take actions that reduce disaster suffering for generations to come. Across FEMA, we're dedicated to support individuals and communities prepare for, withstand, and recover from disasters. But first, let me be clear. Our moonshots that we asked you to advance last year are paramount to building a culture of preparedness. They are a priority for the agency, serving as objectives 1.1 and 1.2 in FEMA's strategic plan. Closing the insurance gap and increasing mitigation, investments in mitigation, will lead to less disaster suffering. Because our moonshots are both aspirational and generational, they are more complex to execute and socialize. We need deliberate and methodical planning and coordination at all levels to successfully identify and execute actions that can measurably increase resilience. Too often I give speeches or interviews that, quite frankly, sound the same. We talk about the recent disaster and their costly impacts. We talk about the huge amount of damages and costs, the unprecedented rainfall or storm surge, repetitive lost properties, the large number of families who are uninsured, and the challenges they have in recovery. Here's the speech I want to give. I want to talk about how the unprecedented rains came again, but this time it didn't cause the extreme damage, heartache, and uncertainty. I want to talk about how the latest disaster costs less than what it would have cost in the past. And I want to talk about how the affected communities and survivors are moving more quickly through their recovery and rebuilding because of insurance, mitigation, sound floodplain management, and strong building codes. The truth is, we're not seeing the outcomes we've been striving for year after year. We need to change the paradigm. This starts at the individual level. It starts with each of us. It starts with you. From where you sit as a floodplain manager, mitigation specialist, a member of the insurance industry, public official, or contractor, where is your sphere of influence? And how are you using that sphere to reduce disaster suffering? I'm confident we can get there, but we need to work together. Across the American landscape and throughout our history, individuals and communities have come together to bring change where change is demanded. I believe we are at a critical crossroads, and the demand for change is now. We are starting a movement to bring that change, to increase resilience, and reduce disaster suffering. As a key stakeholder, ASFPM has tremendous breadth across our nation. We need you to join this journey. This conference is important to FEMA. All 70 of us attending, because it gives us an opportunity to engage with you. We are able to make this commitment because FEMA recognizes how important you are to building a culture of preparedness. My team and I are speaking at 22 sessions this week. We have 4 booths in the exhibit hall, and if you haven't yet had a chance to speak to one of the FEMA staff here this week, I encourage you to do so. We want each of you to understand the game-changing initiatives across each FEMA directorate and office, how we're committed to transforming the NFIP, mitigation, floodplain management, and building codes. But first, I'll start with why. We're making transformational changes for 2 reasons. Cultivate value and trust in all facets of the NFIP, and ensure more homes, families, businesses, renters, and others are insured against flood losses. Both so that in the aftermath of a flood, whether it is a presidentially declared disaster or a smaller, localized flooding event, there is less disaster suffering. How? We're emphasizing customers first. We're reducing complexity and increasing transparency. We're working towards a flood mapping program where we no longer merely present the hazard and talk about the probabilistic floods like the 1% annual chance event, but instead can view structure-specific risk in a way that shows a more comprehensive risk profile and accounts for other types of flood hazards, a modern risk identification program. Another significant part of this transformation is Risk Rating 2.0, which will fundamentally change the way FEMA rates a property's flood risk and prices insurance. We understand, quite frankly, everyone knows that NFIP's current decades-old rating tables are complex and difficult to understand. Risk Rating 2.0 will reduce the complexity of our program by leveraging risk-based data, state-of-the-art industry best practices, and current technology to deliver actuarially sound rates that are fair and that better reflect a property's unique flood risk. We have to get this right, folks. We will not have the generational impact we seek if we do not build a risk rating system that our customers and partners can find value in and can easily understand and intuitively use. We're also making transformational changes to our pre-disaster mitigation program. We know there's a need and an appetite to shift mitigation forward. Mitigation action prior to a disaster is at the core of our mitigation moonshot. Quadrupling mitigation investment demands that we catalyze and incentivize mitigation investments from new partners and in new ways across the whole community. The Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018 is one tool to advance this objective. This legislation created a program we're calling Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities Program, or BRIC, B-R-I-C. BRIC provides a game-changing opportunity by establishing a reliable stream of funding for a new nationwide grant program by leveraging 6% set-aside mechanism based on annual disaster relief expenditures. While there remains a lot of work ahead as we design and implement a new grant program that meaningfully reduces risk and supports our states and communities, FEMA couldn't be more excited as we move mitigation forward to increase resilience across the full spectrum of hazards. Now, with my remaining time, let me spend a few minutes on the reauthorization of the NFIP. As has already been mentioned, Congress must reauthorize our program by the end of the month. On May 10th, the House added an amendment to the Disaster Supplemental Appropriation, which would extend our authorization to September 30th of this year. 4 days later, they passed a standalone extension to do the same thing. Senator Kennedy earlier this week introduced two bills. The first to extend to September 30 of this year, and the second, an 18-month extension to 12/1 of 2020. So it appears there's momentum to avoid a lapse again in the program. While authorization is ultimately in Congress' hands, I can assure you that we continue to do everything we can to ensure that Congress understands the key issues. And one key issue is the need for a sound financial framework, one that recognizes what policyholders can bear when it comes to catastrophic events, how the reserve fund contributes, how reinsurance can carry some of the risk, and then and only then, an understanding that the taxpayer will kick in just like they do for all other federal catastrophic recovery programs. Of course, a key topic of discussion is the program's $20+ billion debt accumulated by making good on flood claims from the past years and the over $400 million in annual interest paid to the Treasury. Ultimately, we're looking to manage the financial well-being of the flood insurance program to a 1-in-20-year event. In the meantime, reinsurance will continue to be one of the tools used to help strengthen the financial framework of the program. As we approach the upcoming hurricane season, FEMA has transferred $2.12 billion of NFIP flood risk to the private sector by accessing traditional reinsurance companies and the capital markets. Friends, 3 years ago, we were transferring none of our risk to the private sector. Reinsurance benefits policyholders and taxpayers by expanding the role of private markets in managing U.S. flood risk. So let me wrap up with the challenge. We can talk about the change we need with little or no action and the same results. Or we can work together to build momentum for a change, to build a movement fueled by taking even more actions in new, collaborative, and innovative ways. Which conversation do you want to hear next year? Which story do you want the next generation to hear? One about a community's disaster suffering and long road to recovery? Or a story about how a community withstood an unprecedented storm because of its bold actions to mitigate and insure against risk? Let's use the rest of this week to ignite this movement. As you head back to your offices and homes, Use your spheres of influence in your neighborhood, your community, your city and state to build a culture of preparedness and reduce disaster suffering. Thank you. Look forward to your questions.